The first thing they heard was a high-pitched whistling noise in the air just before the explosion a few hundred yards in front of them. Mud flying over their head and shrapnel over their head. Harry, covered with mud on his helmet and his thick glasses, crawled in the foxhole toward Charlie. "Charlie, aim the cannon 3 degrees more to the left." "Yes, sir." "Captain Harry, I'll do that." Charlie drops in a 10-pound mortar, aims it 3 degrees to the left. Just then, another explosion comes just to the right of him. It's getting a bit closer. "Come on, Charlie, hurry up, hit him." Drops in that mortar shell, off it goes, sails through the air. Harry pops up over the foxhole with his glasses, and he takes a look over there, and he sees it's a direct hit. "Charlie, you got him, you hit him." There's body parts, and there's cannon parts, and there's stuff flying all over the place. The Krauts are dead. They got him. "We got him, Charlie, we got him." That's what Harry said. Well, that was on September 26, 1918, in the heat of World War I in France. Battery D, 129th Division, field artillery of the 31st Division out of Kansas City. Just think, a year before that, there were these boys in Kansas City. Harry had just finished law school. He had been working on a family farm when the war broke out. He was asked to call and serve for his country. Charlie had just gotten an apprentice. He was 17 years old and just got an apprenticeship job with a small little company called Hallmark in Kansas City. Well, the war called and the boys went off, 125 of them in that division. They took off and they came over to World War I and they served their country stolidly. Then the war was over and they came back home. Harry looked around and he said, "You know what? I'm going to go marry that girl that I've been dating for a while." So he married Bess and he opened a haberdashery in Kansas City, and he failed at that haberdashery. So then he thought, well, I've got a law degree, and someone said I should get into that. So he got into law, and then he was elected to judge in Kansas City, and soon enough, after a few years, he was elected to senator of Missouri, and then Franklin Roosevelt asked him to be his running mate. He was vice president, and then, of course, president. I'm talking, of course, about Harry S. Truman, the 23rd president of the United States. Charlie came back from the war. He looked around. He saw that his girlfriend, Verna, had left Kansas City. You see, during the war, Verna's father had been killed in a railroad accident. And so the widowed mother took her 3 daughters, got on a train, and headed out to Los Angeles. When they came to Los Angeles, at the Union Station, they ran into a gentleman, an older gentleman, called Abbott Kinney. Abbott Kinney had just developed an area down in Venice. He said, "Come on with me, I'll get you an apartment down there." So he took them down to Venice and set up an apartment down at Abbott Kinney Boulevard down, which now Abbott Kinney Boulevard down there. Well, Charlie coming back from Kansas City, found that his girlfriend wasn't there. He went over to his employer, Joyce Hall, and said, "I'm sorry, I won't be able to work here anymore. I'm going to go to Los Angeles, look for my girlfriend." He got on a train, came out to L.A., went and found Verna over in Venice. They got married. A few years later then, he worked for a greeting card company in L.A., and a few years later, he opened his own shingle down the street. It's called Burdge Engraving Company. Talking about my grandfather, Charlie Burdge. And so Charlie opened up the Burdge Engraving Company down on 7th Street. Well, after a while, Charlie and Verna had a son, Richard. And they grew up they had a little home on Selby Avenue, just north of Wilshire in West LA. And Richard was real keen into sailing. He built a little boat and went off Santa Monica Pier and sailed it out there. And so when it was time to go to college, he wanted to be a naval architect. Best school for that was USC, but he couldn't afford that. His parents couldn't afford USC. So he enrolled in ROTC, in the Naval ROTC. Then on December 8th, 1941, he was a sophomore, just turned 20 years old a week before. The whole student body was called into Boulevard Auditorium, and they heard Franklin Roosevelt declare war on the Japanese. We were thrust into war. They just bombed Pearl Harbor the day before. Well, this 20-year-old captain was made captain all of a sudden. 2 weeks later, he found himself out in the South Pacific in charge of a 172-foot minesweeper with 62 men on board. He's the captain of this ship, and he can't even drink with his officers. He grew up fast in World War II. During the war, of course, Charlie's friend Harry, his vice president, senator, and then vice president of the United States. So when Harry was senator, they stayed in touch, Harry and Charlie. Charlie would go back for reunions at Battery D all the time. So they kept in touch, they're very good friends. Harry, out here in Los Angeles, came over to my grandparents' house for dinner one night. My dad, Richard, is overseas serving, and I saw a letter from the White House stationery thanking them, my grandparents, for the nice dinner, and hadn't written on the letter, it said, "By the way, I checked on the boy and he's safe." It's nice to hear. Well, of course, what happened next was Roosevelt died in office. Harry Truman, on May 8th, 1945, decides to bomb Hiroshima and Nagasaki, effectively ending the war in Japan. My dad came home from the war, went back to USC, and finished his degree. Well, a couple of years later then, of course, Harry was running for office, and it was a tight race. He was in a race against Dewey out of Chicago, a Republican. And he asked my grandfather, said, "I'd like some help on the campaign out there. Would you mind joining me down in San Diego?" Grandfather, of course, said, "Sure, I'll help you, Harry. Anything you'd like me to do?" He said, "Well, bring your son down and your wife. Come down and join me." Went down to San Diego. They got on the presidential train as Harry stopped in Oceanside and Santa Ana and gave talks to the crowds, the campaign speeches. Well, imagine this. Here's Harry's presidential train pulling into Union Station. My grandmother Verna behind him, with my father on one side of Harry Truman, and my grandfather on the other side of Harry Truman, as he's preaching to the crowds with his lecture. Imagine how Verna felt just 30 years earlier when she came into Union Station with not a penny and just her bags and her widowed mother. Wouldn't her mother have been proud of her at that time? I think so. Well, after the war then, my father saved some money up and he bought a little sailboat, was sailing around Newport Beach. He saw a cute-looking girl over there, decided, I'm going to go marry her. So he married my mom, Marilyn, and in 1956, had a son, Don, just a few miles away from here at Good Samaritan Hospital. Well, I grew up in the San Fernando Valley, and one of the first things I did when I was 13 years old, I joined the Boy Scouts. I got a lot out of the Boy Scouts. In fact, when I was 15 years old, I became Eagle Scout. And one of the things you do when you're Eagle Scout is you send out a letter inviting people to a special court of honor. Well, my grandfather had passed away a couple of years before, but I sent one to my grandmother, and she decided to send that invitation off to her friend Harry Truman. So Harry, then, I'm riding my bike back from school, and my mom says, "You've got a letter." I opened this letter up. It's dated November 16th, 1971. "Dear Don, I am to inform you that you are to be honored at a special ceremony upon your attainment of the rank of Eagle Scout. Your grandfather, Charlie Burdge, whom I knew very well, if he were alive today, would be very proud of you. My congratulations to you for this coveted achievement and best wishes for a happy life. Sincerely yours, Harry S. Truman." I often think about, Harry passed away then 1 year later, on December 26th of 1972. And I often think about what would have happened on those battlefields in France if the enemy had aimed a little faster and a little better than Charlie and Harry had aimed. We wouldn't have had the 23rd president named Harry Truman. And that president may not have had the courage to drop a bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and in the war when it did, there wouldn't have been a Truman Doctrine to rebuild Europe. Charlie would have never come back to find Verna, and I wouldn't be here today to tell you how Harry met Charlie.